Okay, it's recording.
Good afternoon, Kevs. How are you doing? Thank you for hosting us in this beautiful house of yours and in such short notice to agree to be part of these people behind the papers project. Just to give you a little bit of background on this project, we are trying to look at how social research psychologists in South Africa got to where they are, or the challenges that they encounter. In a nutshell, we are trying to give survey on what it is like to be a social science researcher in South Africa.
Okay.
So the conversation will most definitely not be about the content of your work, even if we talk about the content. I think the nutshell would be on the processes behind the work and how it affects you as a person and as a profession. So
it's a nice project. I'm glad to be part of it.
Eventually. Yeah, elusive. We try to can hold if you like. Yeah, so a brief background on those who do not know who Kevin is, personally and academically. Who is Kevin?
Wow, that's quite a curveball to start with. Well, I'm an ordinary guy, grew up in East London in apartheid South Africa, went to like sort of a boys only, whites only school, had various, struggles, not the least of which was not going to the military, which sort of was a very important defining part of my early life, and then went to London. I left. I did my sentence to. I did a sentence, and when that was over, I was due to community service. When that was over, I went to London. Then I returned to do an honours at UCT. I did a doctorate there, and I worked there for 4 years. And then I came to KwaZulu-Natal to work at the then University of KwaZulu-Natal.
Where were you based in London?
I was selling paintings door to door. I lived in Fulham. That's actually where I met my wife. She was also selling paintings at a rival company.
So you're an art guy.
Yes, I like art.
You can see your house is full of nice decorations.
Yeah.
And so going back to the history, and it's an interesting part that you touched on. You grew up in the apartheid era, white-only school. And when one looks at the work that you've done, does growing up in that kind of environment affected or influenced how you perceive the world?
Absolutely. I live on the margins, I work on the margins, and funny, even though you went to like sort of, I was like sort of the dominant group, the white male, at like this kind of privileged school, but I felt even then at the margins of that society and that culture. So I feel that the context that I've grown up in has been like fundamental to who I am. It's obviously not like a kind of linear narrative where I had this influence and so I did this kind of work. It's funny how direction and purpose in a life sort of unfolds and coalesces as you live it. So, but yes, it was. I think that's the kind of marginality. Ironically, I suppose everyone is sort of claiming victimhood, but I do have a sense in my life as working from the margins.
Interestingly enough, like I don't know what, but let's talk a little bit about the history. So you said you skipped military.
Yes.
And it was compulsory.
Yes.
And why did you decide to do psychology in the first place?
I actually registered because I wasn't going into the military. I studied through NISA, my undergraduate. So I did quite well at school. I sort of liked school and I liked studying in that. But then I didn't go. A lot of my friends went off to university, and I sort of thought I would like sort of take a stand, you know. And I studied through NISA, and I was doing a BSc. I started off. I mean, I did a BSc. I was going to do, I was doing physics and chemistry and computers and stuff like that, and maths. And I did a course in philosophy, which led me into psychology. And my interest started changing. I sort of discovered existentialism. It was like so interesting, so exciting. Sort of made you think thoughts that you hadn't thought before, which was liberating and exciting. And I then sort of went in that direction. So it's, yeah, it wasn't like there was no sort of great purpose or great plan. I don't think any life has a great plan there.
Yeah. Like touching on philosophy and BSc, it's quite obvious from the work that you've been doing, and I've been reading your books on quantitative stuff and the numbers and whatnot. Now I understand where you come from. So you did BSc,
Yeah.
maths, computers.
Did maths. I majored in statistics and psychology. So there's quite a, and I do, since then I do quite a lot of qualitative work. So I'm quite happy with qualitative work and quantitative work. I'm not a kind of, I'm not a purist.
Touching on purist, there was a paper that I read. I think you wrote it. It was published in 2011, where you talk about discovering discursive psychology, and you make it a point to say I did it while you were a postgrad student at UCT. I'd like to go back to that era. Who were the first people who kind of not influenced you, but whom you worked with at UCT that I don't know how to say paved the way, but people who influenced the work that you're currently doing?
Well, it was actually quite a, when I spent 4 years working there. They had this post called the Junior Research Fellow, and the other people that had that post as well was Colin Traduce, who's professor at UCT, John Dixon, who's professor at Open University, Lindy Wilbraham, who's professor at Rhodes. So it was there were quite a few people that, and some of those relationships, like the times between John and Colin and myself, are still firm. We still do research together, we still collaborate, we still publish together. So a lot of those times. So in one part there was the zeitgeist, with a whole lot of people.
And you're still young, like all of you.
We're all still young. Don Foster was an important character he supervised our work. Anne Levette supervised Lindy, and she was also an important figure. Ian Parker came to, Ian and Erica came to UCT at that time. There was a little conference, that's where I met Martin at that conference. So it was a sort of mid-90s, early to mid-90s. It was a kind of young students in South Africa sort of embracing this new wave of social constructionism that I suppose in the 1980s was changing the subject. 1984 it sort of started happening in our discipline, and sort of a decade later we were there, and
it's amazing. All of you are still there. And, one interesting thing is working social constructivism, and it was the pathway. If you look at the work that you did in the 80s, early 90s, and the work that you do
90s,
90s, and the work that you do now, what has changed, or have you had a different paradigm shift? It's still that old canon we used to.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it's a question about the history of ideas.
Yes.
And the personal history of ideas. So the kind of autobiographical history of ideas. The two things I suppose I can say. The one, and the most important, the heart of it, what's so lovely about being an academic, what's so lovely about being a scholar, is that you've got ideas that you nurture like children for as long as you nurture children. You grow up with them. You live with them. They occupy you. They entertain you. And just like children, you can see yourself change with time through looking at them. So one of the things I'm really grateful for in having this kind of employment, being paid by the state essentially to read and write and to teach, is to be able to nurture ideas over time, to think about similar things, because the object changes, but to think about similar things for 20 years. Fantastic. Also, one thing I've noticed now, sort of in my late 40s, when you've been reading in a field for 20 years, all of a sudden you've got some kind of depth that you couldn't have doing a PhD and just like reading the whole field. There's a kind of sort of implicit knowledge where you get a kind of sense of how things are working in this field of ideas. And so those ideas themselves change and mature. The dynamic between you and your ideas change, and that is, I don't know if does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does.
I don't know what other people have said when you asked them that.
No, I don't ask them. I just asked you. I don't know why. Yeah. And Kevs, most of your work is collaborative work, and that's what I like about you. You work with different people, and yeah, sometimes you do your own work, but most of your work is collaborative. And how do you deal with different personalities when you try to come up with this finished product? And here you are with this personality and that personality, and you actually come up with something brilliant.
I'll try and answer that question in a roundabout way. I met Alex Haslam recently at a European summer school. We were both teaching there. And I said to him, hey, I can't believe that you published so much. You published 12 papers last year. So I said, how do you do it in these diverse fields? And he says, because he's got good friends that he works with. And those friends help him to enter into, to keep going in narratives, in stories that are happening in different diverse parts of the academy. And that made me think about my own work as well. And I've got friends, and these are friends that over a long period of time, you develop a kind of conversation, an ongoing conversation. So these ideas that we're talking about, they aren't like sort of things inside your head. They're conversations that you're having with different people. And when students can enter into those conversations, other people can enter into those conversations, and then we share those. Sort of the publications is the kind of output, but that's all shared. It's the conversation that's vital. So part of doing scholarly work is nurturing these forms of conversation and to invite people into them.
So it's not about meeting in a cafe, drinking coffee, and to do this and that.
Sometimes it has that element. But mostly it's not mostly it's fun. I also at the European Summer School in Limerick recently spent a day in the pub with John Dixon talking about work and planning, other things. It was fun. It was a great day spent in conversation. So yes, it has got outcomes. It does focus, and we work hard, and we do stuff. We write, we produce. We are pretty, we try and care for that kind of production side of things as well. But generally, the process is one of pleasure.
It's amazing because during the past years, academics have been perceived as boring people, and now it kind of makes sense that one gets a lot from informal conversations, and an idea can be nurtured in an informal way and becomes a formal thing to be used by people.
Labour is involved.
Yeah.
There's labour. So academic work it requires doing stuff. And in the process of labouring, like all labour, we transform things from one thing into another. I mean, that's what labour does. Labour is a way of transforming from production, is transforming something into something else. And that process of transformation is not mapped out in advance. It can't be mapped out in advance. So there's always new things and excitement and change, and the unnegotiated in that there has to be sort of thrashed out, to use that metaphor, as you're doing it. But the most important thing is to enter into the project, to start doing things. And when you start doing things, they start gaining a momentum.
And now I'm kind of like lost in this conversation, and I'll retract back. You've been doing quite a lot of work and writing, reading, and getting paid for reading and writing. So it's like, what keeps you going, really? What motivates you? Because certain people find it difficult to write or to sit down and read.
Both of them are, both reading and writing are difficult. So it's labor, and it's not like reading novels or watching movies. It's a different kind of reading. But reading, both reading and writing, are forms of activity that promote creativity. They promote you, they encourage you to start thinking in new ways and thinking new thoughts. And you have to get into, there's a kind of zone that you have to get into. You have to be close enough to the material, and then you start working at it, and all of a sudden, ideas, lines of thought, I don't want to use it, epiphanies even. You have these little insights, and that is where there is great pleasure in that. To be a bit poncy here, Wittgenstein once said, when you read a poem and then you hear a piece of music that says the same thing as the poem, and in his wonderful understatement, he says, it gives you great pleasure. Now, that is pleasure. When you can connect two things, and reading and writing are forms of labor that help you do that work, that yield that pleasure.
Wow, that's powerful. I'll try to listen to it. That's a point. But yeah, that's powerful. And Kevin, I wanted us to touch on, I came across this nicely written paper. I don't know whether you remember it. It's the King, the Cure, and the newspaper man.
Yes.
And you spoke of stereotyping by implication.
Yes.
And it interested me. I actually wanted to hear you talking about it in more depth. What exactly is it?
So this is one of those ideas that's sort of been around with me for some time, and I'm starting to write about. And actually, all my writing, I'm writing at the moment, and I'm finding it's sort of the backcloth to all my thinking in social psychology. Is how do we need to know who we are and who other people are as actors to engage in the social world. We need to know that. Now, social psychology has given us this language of stereotypes, which are bits of knowledge of a group membership, of who we are and the characteristics that go along with it, etc., etc. They're vitally important for us living our lives, and yet they are taboo. You can't go around sort of uttering racist stereotypes, etc. And yet, how do they still do the work of guiding behavior, guiding action? So this is where the notion of stereotyping by implication is, because they are common sense, because you and I share the stereotype. Well, we can't be 100% sure. We have to probe and have a little dance over here. But, when we sort of know, oh, we're talking about that, oh yes, I know what you're talking about, we don't actually have to mention the stereotype and articulate it in all of its what I say, the florid detail. You know, you don't have to like say things like librarians are bookish and quiet. This is the example that I often use. We can sort of have a kind of common sense about librarians, then we can talk about the librarian over there, you know what I mean, that explains that, and it explains why I behave like this, etc. So the stereotype by implication is the way in which stereotypes as shared knowledge in the kind of background to life animate us or allow us to coordinate our activities and our opinions, etc., in a certain way that allows us, that stereotype, to do the work that it's designed to do. In other words, to prop up forms of inequality, etc., without it actually ever becoming explicit. And I think that's a very important way, which is, social psychology misses that, because they ask you, like, list your stereotypes. They require it always to be explicit.
Yeah, but then there is an implicit part.
Yes.
Which brings me to the next point, and I know there are a lot of people who write about racism, race. Then you came up with a nice concept, race travel.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna torn between. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between that race travel and stereotyping by implication. Do they have a little bit of similarity?
Very much so. Very much so. So race trouble is exactly that these ideas about race are, they're part of common sense. They are doing work all the time, not explicitly. Sometimes it becomes explicit, but when it becomes explicit, oh, you're being racist or that, then a different form of life starts happening. There's a different kind of engagement, very defensive, denial, etc., etc. But most often, ideas about race are operating in the background the whole time. And so we live in a world that's entirely racialized, that continues to be racialized, and yet people aren't talking about race the whole time. And so, yes, these ideas about what's happening in the kind of the background or the backcloth to life is vitally important in racial. And we get a sense, hey, am I being racialized here? Is this at play? Or, ooh, I hope they don't think I'm like that. So there's all this. That's why I use the notion of race trouble. It's like, it's sort of in the background. Now, a lot of the people that have reviewed race trouble, they accuse the book of wanting to get rid of the idea of racism, or reifying race, saying using these same more race categories. But the basic point is that you can't understand the book without this notion of stereotyping by implication, because what I'm trying to argue, or what we're trying to argue, is that these ideas about race are things that people are using all the time. You can't by an edict get people to like stop using it. You can try, but even when you do that, you start becoming racialized. It produces race trouble of its own kind.
So you call it spade a spade?
Well, I think so. And it's been interesting to see how the book's been reviewed, because it's been quite it's a bitter pill to swallow.
Have you received reviews?
There have been 5 reviews so far.
So it's great. Yeah, that's great. And they're completely different.
They range from, and then in different contexts. Some of them are South African, some of them are overseas. One's ethnic and racial studies, theory and psychology, PINS, psychology and society.
Do you think the context makes it different for people to come up with different ideas and reviews? Like a guy from Britain or from America and a reviewer from South Africa?
I've spoken to some people from the States that have read the book, and they, I think they do get a slightly different take on it, but I don't know if I think these kinds of ideas are troubling no matter where you are. Race is a trouble, and sort of engaging with issues of race is troubling. I don't know how to answer it.
You're very strong theoretically. So, Kevs, can I ask you, I know maybe it may sound difficult, but how do you translate theory into everyday living for you? as kids, you read the race stereotypes, prejudices, and what we need to do. And how do you translate it in the real world?
That is like a very difficult question. I don't know how to answer that. In many respects, the theoretical issues are so perplexing, not only theoretically but sort of morally or ethically, that it's very difficult to know how to live. I don't know if you also find that. I mean, I think it's quite difficult. I mean, the work that I'm doing on domestic labour at the moment is a case in point. So my new work on race job is trying to look in the context of domestic labour. And when you speak to employers of domestic workers, they all say how much they are helping. There's this whole narrative of, look how generous I am, look at the terrible conditions that she's in, the house burned down. There's all these tales of tragedy, and then there's this notion of but look at how we do, we built a house, or we paid for the school fees, or we sort of did this, and we gave clothes, and we did that. And at one level you can see this kind of paternalism as part of the exact problem. You wouldn't, if you paid someone a decent wage, you wouldn't need to do all this helping, and then, But on the other hand, does that mean you shouldn't help? Yeah. Or you shouldn't be generous, or you shouldn't dignify, or...
So it becomes a double-edged sword.
Well, how do you live in a world like this? In a world that is so riven with inequality that you're part of, and you're participating in, and you're benefiting from in some very indirect, or maybe even very direct way. How do you act? And I don't know if anyone is going to be able to answer your question and say, well, here's a theory, this is how I'm going to act. There's a simple way. The whole time, the struggles and contradictions of life, it's helping to inform how you're thinking about things. And so, it's a tough question that I can't answer properly.
And looking at the research projects that are currently involved with and looking at what you've just said, so you read the theory and then this is the real life. It's not a linear thing. It's not easy to connect the dots. But do you find pleasure in the projects that are currently involved in, like this? Not daily.
Yes.
When you leave your office and you...
It's lovely. I love doing that. So we're planning a new study. We're looking at intergroup contact. There's an informal settlement in Northdale. In winter time, believe it or not, the municipality came, they pulled up all the illegal electricity connections because the people in Northdale were complaining that it affected their electricity, that they had lots of shorts, etc. And so there's a kind of intergroup situation there. The informal settlement is black and the Northdale is historically Indian. So we've got this a kind of complex overlay of kind of race and class. One of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is the effects of intergroup contact, etc. So we're going to be looking at intergroup contact, the possibilities for solidarity between two historically oppressed groups. So it's an interesting, exciting project. Great to be able to do it once again, collaborating with colleagues at UKZN plus John Dixon and Colin Trudeau, so old friends. Old friends coming together. It gives us a chance to work together, to visit each other, to continue those conversations that we have, and also to write influential pieces, hopefully. We can't tell, we've got an idea of the kinds of things that we want to, the kinds of papers we want to write. We can't tell exactly what it's going to be, but hopefully we can also have an impact or have a presence in social psychology.
That's what I was about to ask you. Are you planning to write academic pieces, or are you also planning to kind of influence policy? by this kind of project that you're currently involved in?
So our primary thinking is academic. Our primary thinking is academic. I haven't been very good at translating academic work into policy and into other forms of writing. We started that blog where you read that piece. It hasn't really been very successful, but we started as our little group to try and write in other ways and try and do other kinds of things. That would be great. We've got some students and some other collaborators that are better at that are doing that. But the honest truth is that my work hasn't done that, and it's been a failure in that sense.
Yeah, Kev, one last thing that I want you to kind of briefly talk about is social psychology, cognitions, and experiments. And I thought about this when you showed me the secret lab.
Welcome to the lab. This is the psych lab.
Yes, and do you see the connection between social psychology as a discipline and cognitive psychology plus the experimental study? Have they always been?
Well, I haven't. My tradition, I've done surveys and qualitative work so far in my academic work. Social psychology is primarily an experimental discipline, so all the influential work in the discipline is experimental. There's a beauty to experiments, there's a simplicity to experiments, they have a power in answering questions in a very abstract way. Mick Billig, in his book on rhetoric, arguing and thinking, he suggests that experiments are very good examples. So experiments can be used like any other events in life, etc. They can enter into rhetoric. They're not sort of definitive answers everything, but they are instances where events happen under certain kinds of conditions, which you can use rhetorically to make certain kinds of points. I mean, these points can be policy-related points, they can be all academic points. So experiments have that value. The problem, I think, with experiments is that they have very often tended to treat human beings, the participants or the subjects of these experiments, not in not really human terms. So they put you in a certain situation and then you fill out a little questionnaire or something, and then you've got a snapshot of the effect of that situation on you. So it's a kind of very mechanistic model. We're setting up a lab at the moment, and we're developing some software that allows participants to interact with each other and to see how, for example, if you put people in a situation with different amounts of resources, you create inequality, how does interaction unfold? So we're interested in a kind of temporal process by which the kind of phenomena that we're interested in, let's say it's ethnocentrism or prejudice or bias or whatever, how does that, or inequality, how does that come about through a whole lot of people interacting with each other and making their own individual decisions, producing this kind of collective outcome. Now, for me, that is what social psychology is about. You can study it in the lab just as much as you can study it outside the lab.
So are you doing it in collaboration with students? On this social psychology students?
I was in Amsterdam recently and met with people in artificial intelligence, and there might be possibilities of applications in robotics, in collective robotics. So there's possibilities for really interesting applications, for interesting kind of work. So it's still in the early stages. We're writing. We've got an NRF grant to write some software to make this environment, to create this kind of this virtual environment in which interaction can take place. So hopefully, all these kind of things, it's like fishing. You put your line in the water and then you see what happens.
And hopefully all this will be ethically approved. When you're looking at attitudes and...
Well, I mean, I don't see like huge ethical issues with putting people in a situation, asking them to sort of give and take.
not a pure experiment.
Well, we do manipulate things. Like, for example, we put people in a situation where they're all individuals, then we put people in a situation where they're members of groups. And does that affect how they interact with each other? Or some groups are more powerful than other groups, does that affect? Or the process of ostracism, if we just don't give to one person, how does that...
Yeah, I guess that's a bit about social psychology experiments. They're not that complicated when it comes to the ethics and all that.
Well, if you take a look at the history of social psychology, Milgram, Zimbardo, I mean, there's been some pretty unethical... the history of our discipline is not great ethically.
As I was asking the question of ethics, so hopefully...
Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah. I think we've come to the end of our chat conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for... I feel like a bit awkward being in front of a camera, and a bit awkward being selected, and I wish you well with the project. And it's been great actually getting to know you. One thing that this has enabled us to do is to get to know each other a bit better.
Hopefully, still have some time to... Okay.
Okay. Cheers.
Sure.
Cheers.
Bye.